Welcome to the Life After Diets podcast with Stephanie Michelle. For anybody listening for the first time, I'm Stephanie Michelle. For anybody listening for more than the first time, this is the first time that I am recording this podcast solo without my trusted steed. Is that a thing? Without my trusty co host, Sarah Dosange, who has left the building for the time being. She is off to new ventures, and I'm going to keep moving. And as you can see, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'm here in my room. And do you want to know why? Why I'm recording from my bedroom? Because I just recorded an entire episode for you in my living room where I normally record from. And there was no sound. There was no audio. So now my kids are home from school and I have to record. And this is called doing it imperfectly. I did want to talk today about identity. And I thought it was a good topic because I kind of feel like I too am in the middle of another bit of an identity crisis as I navigate who I am on this podcast alone and in the middle of transitions, a lot of transitions going on for me just in general, I think at this time of life. And identity is very wrapped up in our food and our body image. And I thought of this story. I was, thinking about sharing this. It's a vulnerable one. Yeah, I hesitate telling it because it's one of those stories where you're like, that doesn't represent who I am, but it is something that happened to me and that I did. And I wanted to talk about it because it directly folds into how strong my sense of protecting my own identity was at one time when my eating disorder was just developing, and how out of character it was kind of a testament to how strong that protective instinct was. And so I'm going to tell it. So I kind of pulled a Mean Girls moment, actually. And this is going back to my teenage years when my eating disorder first developed. For a little bit of background, I started, I'd been dieting since I was about 10 years old. I come from a family of 3 kids. I'm the oldest. I have a younger sister who's a couple of years younger than I am. And then I've got a brother who's 4 years younger. My sister was always a petite person. And we were close enough in age that there was a sense of competition, as there is, among sisters many times. And so I had been bigger boned and she was always smaller. So I was the one who was dieting. I was the one who had the body image stuff and was worried about how things looked, how clothes looked on me and what foods we were eating and things like that. But up until the age of about 15, I was a diet dabbler. My mom didn't diet. I was the only one in the house that really did that. And by the time I reached 15 years old, it started to take on a new flavor. It started to get more intense, and I started to become obsessed with food and with low-fat products because it was the 90s. So that's what we were doing. So I was, telling my mom, no, we can't buy this and I won't eat that. And you have to make this without the chicken fat and you have to make this without the oil. And, I was really becoming identified with dieting. And at the same time, I was also entering high school and I just wasn't ready. I don't think I was ready to enter high school. There was something about the feeling it brought me of like growing up too fast. And for whatever reasons, I just didn't feel ready to be as old as I was. And one of the ways that showed up was when everyone started to get boyfriends, because of course you go to high school and then people start dating, right? And my very best friend, who is still one of my very best friends, started dating this guy who I really liked, actually, and I still really like. And slowly, I started to have to share her with him. And things that normally she would have invited me to, or she would have had me over for dinner, or she would have, had me go to the mall with her, started to move over to him. And it made me feel lonely. I felt abandoned. I felt rejected. I felt left behind. I felt like the world was moving on in this way that everyone seemed very excited to do, that I felt not only that I wasn't excited to do, but that I didn't have access to. I felt like I wasn't being chosen as anybody's girlfriend. I wasn't fitting in right that way. And it was simultaneously like this resentment of getting older and also this feeling of why not me? And at the time, when you're 15 years old and you're in adolescence and you're figuring out who you are and you're forming identities through your peer groups and your social relationships, I felt stuck and stagnant and wrong. And I don't think it was a coincidence that that was the time when my dieting ramped up and that my eating disorder really started to become actually an eating disorder. Now, of course, I had other things going on in the backdrop of my family landscape. And, this wasn't the only reason that I developed an eating disorder, but this was the catalyst for it. And it was rooted in loneliness, identity, and the way those things intersect with the onset of adulthood and leaving childhood. What started to happen was the more that I dieted, the more that I restricted, the more weight I started to lose, and the more attention that I started to get. And by the time I got into my second year of high school, I was starting to receive, I was starting to fit in. I was starting to get attention from the boys. I got my first boyfriend. I belonged, right? And I associated that belonging with my body changing and with the restriction that had got me there. All of this is happening subconsciously, of course, and in no way am I consciously thinking, okay, well, my identity is being thin, and so I will become identified with my restrictive eating disorder, and I will protect it at all costs. But this is not what your conscious mind says, but it is in essence kind of what happens. And so the story that I wanted to tell is about a time when that got threatened. Um, my family moved to Massachusetts for my senior year of high school, which all by itself was terrible. Talking about identity, like I landed in the middle of this school where everybody had known each other since they were little, it was a small town. And here I was, like this new kid in the last year of school, and I had nobody. I all I wanted to do was go back home. I did not want to be there. I'm an introvert. I was not like, yay, new people. I was like, oh my gosh, get me out of here. And I'm sure that I read that way. And I just had no interest in establishing relationships here. I just wanted to go home. So my identity became further compromised because I wasn't anybody there. I guess looking back, I'm like, oh, I could have really made myself anew, but I didn't want to. At that time, your identity is so insecure as it is. And being a new student at a new school was just testing what was already so shaky ground. And it was during this time that my sister, who I mentioned is 2 years younger than I am, and as I look back, I think, this was her also trying to cope. She started to diet as well, and she started to get on board with the things that I was doing, and she started to ask me questions about the way that I ate, and I noticed that she started to mimic it. And um, I don't remember consciously registering it, like, and thinking about it, but I know that I felt very threatened by that. And the more that she dieted and the longer she dieted, the more weight she lost. And I watched her losing weight, eating like me. And then my mother was like, well, I think I'll go on a diet too. And then she got on board. And soon enough, everything that I thought had made me me and everything that I knew, because I over identified with this, and I was the one who knew about all the grams of fat and everything. And I was the one who knew how you adapted recipes to be like X, Y, and Z. And this was something that everybody came to me for in my family. And this was the thing. This was mine. This was mine. This was the way I identified. And now other people were kind of catching up. And I felt like I was going to be erased. I felt like if I didn't reclaim my position here, who would I be? Like, I wouldn't be special. And so one day I went to the store. I had gotten my license, and I went to the store and I bought these what are, I think, granola bars is what they were, and they were covered in chocolate as well, and they were high calorie, high fat, delicious chocolate covered granola bars. This was really a Mean Girls moment because if you've ever seen the movie, the Lindsay Lohan character takes the bars that athletes take to gain weight, and she feeds them to Regina George, right? Telling her that they are in fact diet bars. This happened long before Mean Girls ever came out, and I did this. I took these granola bars back home. I unwrapped them so that they didn't have the wrapper with any of the information on them. I put them in a bag and I let them sit in the kitchen. And I didn't say a word because I knew that anything that I brought home and anything that I would think was worthy of bringing home, that my mom and my sister would be interested in it. And my sister asked me what they were, and I said, these are my fat burner bars. and I left them so that they would eat them. And they did. And I don't remember what happened after that. I'm sure it amounted to nothing, but I did this thing. And I remember I talked about it in therapy many times because it's ultimately quite manipulative and it doesn't align with my character today. It didn't align with my character then. It was just the desperation that I felt to protect what I perceived to be who I was and that other people were threatening. And I tell this story because while many of us as adults aren't doing things like that, this is quite an adolescent story. I don't think it's unrelated to the difficulty we feel with recovery insofar as it takes away from a part of our identity and what identity has been built around our bodies and our food. And, I recognize too that there's different ends of the spectrum where some listeners here are on the restrictive end or the over-exercising end, and they're known as the fit ones, or they're known as the clean eaters, or the marathon runners. That is an identity because there's privilege in it, there's social validity to it, there's access in it that is being potentially taken away through recovery if we gain weight and we eat more foods. There's also the other side where, if you're somebody who doesn't restrict, there's less of this idea of giving up some kind of social identity, but there's still identity wrapped up in who we believe ourselves to be and how we see ourselves. So even the identity of being a binge eater at some point, even if it's perceived as a negative piece of our identity, we do attach to who we believe ourselves to be. And so when I think about the years that I was binge eating and I was absolutely not in a privileged body and I was not exercising and not clean eating and just basically binging every day, there was also a part of me that attached to that definition of myself because I started to understand myself as a lazy, gluttonous, can't get it together, chaotic, can't cope with life human being. And when you identify as something, it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we also may not understand ourselves outside of it. So we continue to put ourselves in boxes through the ways that we categorize ourselves. And to some extent, we're going to need to do this. We have to have some kind of healthy ego to navigate the world and navigate relationships. But I think that sometimes we so identify with certain stories about ourselves that we limit who we are, and then we can't step out of that box. And in either case, whether we're identified with identities that we really want and we're afraid to lose, or we're identified with things that we don't want, but we're also afraid to lose, because who are we without it? This is the question. Who will we be without that thing? Because that identity in that box becomes everything we know to be true about ourselves. And even though we may fantasize about I want to get out of these boxes. I don't want this anymore. And I think that's probably true from the authentic point of view, right? Like from our authentic self that wants to be free of the boxes we've put ourselves in. There's also parts of us that are going to say, well, there's a reason that I'm here. And also, we don't know what it's like outside of this box. And while the theory of it is well and good, I don't trust it. And also, if we become something different than what we are, how are our relationships going to look? People depend on us to be the way we are. The foundations of everything we do, say, and belong to have some relationship to who we are now and who we are in this moment. So if that changes, we won't be this person that has the things we have. So we won't have access necessarily to the same safeties that we have now. And we know that safety is the most important driver of our primal brain. And so because I could probably talk for a long time, and as it happens, I recorded this episode without any sound, and I thought it was going to be 20 minutes, and it was 45. I thought it would be helpful to offer a tool or a concept to think about who we are absent of our primary roles or the ways that we identify ourselves now. And so I had this other story about a client that I have who I've been seeing for about a year and a half, who arrives to every session, and the way we interact, she's very thoughtful. She's very down to earth. She's very intelligent. And steady, does things by the book. But every now and then, she will sort of betray herself a little and she'll start talking in this way that's really kind of feisty, a little sassy, fun, it's a little fiery. It's very different from the way that she typically presents on camera. And this has been a long time that we've known each other. And it's this delightful piece of and it almost feels like this glimpse into a different part of herself. And we've talked about it. Like I've named it to her and she doesn't identify with it. So she understands what I'm talking about, but she doesn't feel like it's her, or she doesn't feel like she can claim it as her. And so we did this experiment once where, well, we're actually working on trying on like the way you would try on a jacket. And so to extend this to you, like, are there parts of you that come out sometimes? Maybe they come out around certain people, or maybe they come out in certain environments, or maybe they come out when you're in a certain mood. And it represents a part of you or parts of you that don't otherwise take center stage. And it's important that this part of you feels intriguing enough to want to try it on, but to start to pay more attention to these parts and to give yourself a little bit of permission to explore these parts, even if you don't feel like you completely identify with them. But consider that they may be inside of you somewhere. They may not be the front runner. They may not be something that you often let lead. And I'm sure that we'll have stories about that, like, oh no, I can't enter that part of myself because if I did, then XYZ. And we always have these reasons why we need these parts to stay in these places and these to stay in these. But to start to question, is this a part of me that is looking to take up more space? Another way of doing this is to think about, are there ways that you categorize yourself or label yourself? Either things like I'm not a morning person, or I'm so lazy I hate to exercise, or I'm not artistic, or I'm not creative. There's a story there that we're telling other people, but we're also telling ourselves because we've believed it for so long. And if you catch yourself doing something like that, whether to somebody else or inside of yourself, like I'm not someone who, or I am someone who, to poke a hole in it, to just question, is that always true? Or is there another way of looking at myself differently? Because I think those are the times where we are boxing ourselves into something. And maybe a lot of times I think these are stories that we got. I called myself cold. And what's the other word I used to? I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, that my family, my dad in particular, used to call me the cat. And he did that because I was a slow to warm up child, And so he called me the cat, and it was meant to be like I was cold. And I called myself this, and I thought of myself this up until about a year ago. And I've reframed it to understand I'm not cold, because it never even felt true. It felt like I'm not a cold person, but I guess I am a cold person, right? And I would say it, and I would be like, I'm not the kind of person who hugs, and I do feel a little bit uncomfortable hugging people sometimes, but I wonder if that has to do with this identity that I grew up with. And so thinking about what are the labels that you have been assigned throughout your life that you have taken on because you didn't have any other way of thinking about yourself or explaining it, or you assumed other people were right, that you're still living inside. You're still living inside that box. And just when these things come up and when these labels come up, to question them. And it doesn't mean that you have to decide they're not true, or it doesn't mean that you have to, go finding identities that you don't resonate with just for the sake of challenging something. But just to think about, are all the ways that I identify myself accurate? Because we are present moment, ever evolving human beings who do change and who do have different ways of exploring our world and our life that don't always need to follow the same line. So I don't want to turn this into a preaching podcast. I really just wanted it to be more about storytelling. And to that end, I also wanted to say that I am starting a Q&A segment. So if you have a question or if you have a topic that you would like to submit for me to read aloud and answer, or we can talk about it or using it as a jumping off point for conversation, I am accepting those, and you can still email the podcast at Life After Diets. Oh my gosh, I don't even know our email address. You can also email me at Stephanie@IamStephanieMichelle.com. But I did want to invite you to ask questions so that I'm not just talking to myself and not only using myself as the basis for storytelling. I do have a question today that came from Kathy, and Kathy has allowed me to use her name. So if you are somebody who wants to submit without using your name, that is also possible. And I will read your question anonymously. But Kathy wrote in, hold on, because I did this podcast earlier, I put it in my archives and now I have to figure out how to unarchive it. All right. And Kathy says, I would describe myself as in semi recovery, but still have days when I struggle with overeating and emotional responses that feel upsetting and uncomfortable. Something that regularly throws me off kilter are the comments made by other people and diet talk in general. Sometimes I'm able to ignore it, and other times I find myself getting defensive. I regularly slip into preaching about the toxicity of diet culture, but often feel worse afterwards because the conversations just continue next time. I'm a primary school teacher, so most of my colleagues are women, and I find myself dreading lunchtimes because discussions are mostly about diets and body comparisons. I suppose my question is, how do we navigate talk of weight loss, weight gain, being good, diets in disguise, calories, lauding of self-punishing behaviors like overexercise and skipping meals, etc. The list goes on. I think this is so hard to experience while simultaneously trying to heal. Yes, it is, because we are actively trying to deconstruct the very values that society, it literally is like reinforcing back to us all the time. It's not even like something from the past that we're now trying to undo in the present. It's like something from the past that is still very alive in the present. And I think part of why it's so hard, especially in the beginning, is because our logical mind might learn about diet culture and our present day values might reject this idea that we need to stay small and to even to stay in identities that don't serve us. And your logical mind's like totally on board with that. But there's a part of us as we're like baby fawns trying to figure this out and trying to live a different life that are still kind of on board with all that. And I think having those conversations right next to you appeal to the part of you that still thinks those things. And if that's one thing. And then if that's not happening, also, it's like there's also the part of us that's like, no, I so fiercely reject this that it makes me upset to witness a culture that's what feels like so blindly just absorbing it and like spreading it around like seed. I feel like that's kind of what gets me, especially maybe having kids where I feel like, no, everybody be quiet. Like, stop it, stop it, stop it. And I understand that instinct to preach. And for the first several years of my recovery, I think I did. And I did that to anybody who would listen and even people who wouldn't. I think that became part of what I started to differentiate as like what felt good and what didn't. And to your point, that it feels worse because you say these things and then the next day you come in and the conversations are there like no discussion was ever had or like nobody really heard you. And I think that management of expectations around where we put our energy when it comes to speaking about this, because there are going to be many, many people who don't receive it and don't want to. And that isn't our job to convince somebody to believe something. But I think it can feel like a way of advocating and just differentiating between, are you saying something because you need to say it and because you need to hear it and it feels important that it's coming from your voice and that you are a voice, because I think that's part of self-empowerment and self-advocacy. I think it's part of the healing process in many cases, and having a voice around these things. But that is different if you're doing that for yourself than expecting that somebody else would change. And are you doing something to actually convince somebody of something, or are you doing it for yourself? Because if we're trying to convince other people of things that they have no interest in being convinced about, we are going to be disappointed and potentially really frustrated. I have a family member who oddly always asks me all about recovery. She's very interested in it. She's sincerely interested. And we talk about it. We have talked about it. And there have been so many times where I'm like, oh, I think she really got it. I think she really heard me. And she's left. She's like, I'm so proud of you, And she's so proud and she's so proud. I just saw her actually last week. And every time the first sentence is the opposite. It's like, it's, and at some point, I did used to get really frustrated. And at some point I had to recognize, this isn't somebody who's going to change, despite the fact that she wants to and that a part of her wants to, but she's so invested in it. And so that management of expectations is, I think, really important of even, and I really feel for this. I wrote a Wednesday Weekly, I believe, on this topic of teachers in particular. I dedicated a series to them because I have some clients that are teachers, and it just seems like such a culture that is so fraught with diet culture, as many other helping professions are, and so is corporate culture as well. But I recognize that saying managing expectations is important, and also to have to be doing that every single day in your work environment, which is where you spend most of your time, is a lot. It's wearing and it's demoralizing. And that's where the internal boundaries come in as well. I mean, having external boundaries around your self expectations is an internal boundary. So is being able to say certain things like, I have a client whose go-to sentence that I've adopted is, "I'm not the right person to talk to about that." I was just like, "That is exactly right. I am not the right person to talk to about that." Um, and redirecting conversations. And I think those are the external boundaries that we can use. But the fact of the matter is, and the reality of the world is that you will be privy to conversations like that. You just will. You can't avoid them. You can do your best to navigate them and have boundaries where possible, but they won't always be possible. And I do think there's value in being able to navigate being around those kind of conversations. And I think part of what we're afraid of, I don't say we as in this particular cohort of people, but just I think uh, humankind lately, I think we're all afraid of feeling turbulence because I think we have so many feelings and I think we have so much turbulence that it's like, I can't do anymore. And I think that practicing managing some small activations or even some moderate activations can be healthy because, yes, there will be conversations around you that piss you off, that make you upset, that feel like that they activate your inner advocate, that they activate your inner child, that and that's okay. It is going to be there. And I think maybe meeting the part of you that gets activated is the greater calling here. So if there is this sense of, and I'm always a big fan of the, that's something you can be like, you know what? Yeah, let yourself feel angry. Let yourself feel heated. Squeeze your fists. I mean, not necessarily in the lunchroom, but like where you notice you go home and you're like, oh. A lot of times I've talked about pressure cooker eating, and sometimes that even can turn into, we're eating to sort of push that back down, or we're eating to manage that activation. And sometimes it's about going into the body and saying, what is here? What is here? Am I frustrated? And where is that frustration? And where do I feel the energy of that frustration coming out? Because if I don't let it out through my body and I don't accept it, it will find another outlet. And so that's a way of thinking about how to manage what is your body doing there? And how can you take intentional time to actually go into your body and say, like, I'm feeling something. I'm feeling something. And I put, the hand to chest, or sometimes I do use the squeezing, or sometimes I'll in the car on the way home or something like that to validate to myself, like, yes, you are having feelings about this. And yes, that's okay. You're allowed to have feelings about this. They are safe here. And then trying to get in touch with what my body needs. And sometimes it needs some motion. And these are things I talk about in my somatic courses and eventually in my Cocoon membership, which is going to be a library of resources that you can use. Or sometimes it's like curling up under the covers, getting a pillow, and, like just soothing yourself a little bit for feeling like it's hard. It's hard. Or putting a hand to your chest to sort of reinforce back to your body, you know what? I know where I am. I know where I am. And I really think it's about coming back to that knowing where you are and who you are along the way, and that other people aren't in the same spot that you are. And the more I think that we return to self here, I think that's identity work. And I didn't even mean to connect these topics. But they do. I think that it is part of identity. It's not the kind that achieves and performs and has a checklist of attributes. It's more the part of us that sits with ourselves, that doesn't self abandon, that has the understanding that we're with ourselves. That's a different kind of foundational self of your own presence and your own capacity to stay. So Thank you for listening. I mean that very much. Thank you so much if you are still here listening. As far as how this podcast is going to keep going, I don't know. You can let me know. I really would appreciate your thoughts on having guests, different ideas for if you like the Q&As, if you have other ideas for different segments, other kinds of ways you'd like to see conversations around these topics evolve, please let me know. I probably will have some guests because I don't know how long I can listen to myself talk just all by myself. But we will see. We will keep marching as we do. And I really, really appreciate you being here. So see you next time.